Hi everyone, and welcome to Dance Prehab Dialogues, a space for dance teachers, parents, and movers who want to be part of a more thoughtful, dancer-centered health ecosystem. I'm Dr. Robert Tsai. I am a dance performance physical therapist and the founder of Dance Prehab Physical Therapy and Performance. Whether you're guiding a young dancer, imagining greater possibilities, or continuing your own movement journey later in life, we're here to explore how preparation, communication, and care can evolve with you. Let's make space for your questions and your curiosity so we can set the stage for sustainability, health, and longevity for ourselves and for future generations of movement artists. Let's chat. Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Reframing Recovery conversation with athletic trainer, strength coach, and all-around wonderful human, Aaron Ngor. In the first half, we covered a little bit about what the value of recovery is currently and its perceptions within the dance community, how recovery isn't necessarily integrated into dance learning experiences, which we continue to hit on, the role of educators when it comes to recovery, and we cover a few practical tips to think about recovery, not just the day of your preparation, but what about the week before, and what about the week before that? And we really emphasize how well you recover on the day of is going to depend on how you set yourself up those couple weeks before. We hope you enjoyed part 1, and let's dive into part 2.
We talk about this idea of like reframing recovery, and maybe it's that. I'm going to use this example just because, right, dance in our world, predominantly female and things like that. It's like, when was the best time to build bone density? Adolescence and youth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then after that, it's, I don't want to say, downhill from there, but or even like muscle mass, just in general, right? It's
like the sale is happening now. You need to
the sale is happening
it's
now.
like you got to grab your deals while you got it, because then you got to pay full price later.
Dude, that's so good. Oh man, I'm gonna take that.
Take it.
Accredited, Aaron.
I just thought of that.
Did not know, but that's it, right? No, absolutely. The sale is happening now. You recover fast. And I know we're talking like lifespan a little bit here, but even in terms of, let's say, over the year, or I'm trying to make this more like bite-sized, because I know a lot of the people that tend to be in our spaces are youth and parents and things like that. But it's that what you do, and I speak from this from having worked with youth in both injury and performance, how well you do in May, June, July will depend entirely on what you do between January and May, right? In the same way that I saw this year in the dancers that I was working with, our ability to manage and maintain in January through May actually was very dependent on what we were doing in the fall before.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give a little bit more specifics, I had them stick with like the same exercise, and there was a little bit of trial and error on my end, right?
Sure.
But I had them stick with the same exercises for a couple months, for a couple weeks, and we tracked RPE, rate of perceived exertion. And so when it came down to January through May, I wasn't really just giving sets and reps anymore. I think at one point I was able to say, hey, we're just looking to maintain. So I want you to, where are you at today? And I want you to maintain maybe like an RPE of a 5 or 6 out of 10, right? For like a heavy competition week. When in the fall, I was able to say, hey, we want to do RPEs of like 7 or 8.
Yep.
And they were able to handle that throughout, right? But just, I look at my once again, Google Charts, Google Sheets feed.
It's amazing, man.
Sheet, everything starts to get like, everything has to stay light. There was just no way we were going to, and I'm going to say, I say true strength and conditioning, but because we're actually trying to seek adaptation, right? I could see that the same loads that they're doing in the fall were definitely harder to maintain during January through May. And so then obviously we had to adjust. So yeah, with that said, what you do in May is going to be very dependent on how you set yourself up starting in January, whether it's performance and especially with injury, right? We get traditionally a lot of dancers that will show up 2 weeks before a summer intensive, before they have to leave. So not only are you having to dance more throughout the days and the weeks, but you're also changing your environment. I've had this ankle pain for the last 4 months.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I can be ready for summer intensive. And my honest to God conversation is, look, you're still probably going to be in pain, because if you've had this much time, and depending on the situation too, right?
Sure.
Maybe it's a quick mobility thing that they can do, and that absolutely does resolve it. I've seen that happen. But on the other hand, if you're dealing with a loading issue, Achilles tendonitis, and we've never really properly given it the load to recover over that period of time, it's still going to bug you. So
that's why is a hard conversation, having been on the other side where it's like the EATs working at these like summer intensives, and these dancers will come in, and it's like, again, we're doing a lot of like education and like symptom management, because I have to tell them that this is not the time when we're doing rehab.
Yeah.
We're just helping you get by, get to the next step, and then also making the call if like you are like in danger of making this worse, then we have to communicate with instructors and stuff. But like, nobody wants to have that conversation.
Nope.
Dancers don't want to have that conversation. I want to.
Yeah, we don't want to have that conversation.
But we have to do it.
Yes.
As we're the ones that's supposed to advocate for their health. So I think there's also that conversation of like, that is another experience, to like be at a place where your parents have like paid a lot of money for you to go to, and you show up there and you're like trying to like be in front of your peers and don't feel like you're up to par with everything, and you feel behind, and then you get hurt. Like, it's a very like tough place to be mentally as well. But I think that's why there needs to be more teams and infrastructures to support these dancers, to catch them when they fall and like, get them back up on their feet so that they can return and dance another day. But I think that it starts, like you said, like the conversations you're building here, the lessons you're like slow baking into these dancers, so that when they do start figuring out what does training mean, what do their rituals look like, instead of like doing 3 sets of like 10 reps of like RDLs while they're training, like maybe that looks like, I'm just going to do 1 set, make sure it feels good, make sure it feels mobile, and then like I move on to the next thing. And, one person could argue, oh, that's not strength training. It's like, look, they're doing what they can.
Yes.
Doing what they need to do. And again, it's not always about the exercise. It's about, do I feel confident in my body? Do I feel stable? Do I feel like I can perform and do what I need to do? Right? And I think that's super important for young dancers to learn, is to learn about their bodies, so that when something is up, they can articulate and advocate for themselves. Because I also feel like on the flip side of it, like a lot of providers may not be like dance informed, or like maybe in their own biases of like what needs to be done. And I feel like a dancer's body is like very particular, and they may know like certain things about them that they may have to be like, no, I think it's like really this.
Yeah.
I feel like it's this when I move and I do this, I feel like there's something like wrong here.
Yeah.
They're trying to drop clues, and I think some people aren't able to like pick that up.
Yeah. And that's just like listening, and once again, a lot of context, right? Because pain and discomfort can just present itself in so many different ways. Just to kind of preface this conversation, is that systems and frameworks are kind of where things need to go. I think we love operating with like the individual. We can make individual changes as needed, but what are sort of the big cultural shifts and changes that have to happen?
Yep.
I'm going to say that it is possible, and we see it happening. It's happening slowly, but and this is one of those things where I'm like, as long as it's happening, it's fine. It almost, sometimes we want changes overnight, but it's also like if changes do happen overnight, sometimes it's like loading too much, too fast, too soon.
Yeah.
People can't see the value of it right away, and then all of a sudden we don't have the buy-in anymore, right? So with that said, you and I have operated in a lot of different settings, and the truth is sometimes and maybe this is just coming from my perspective, it's hard to do in the student environment. There are lots of things where I often feel like maybe the studio isn't the place to introduce this. I think we can maybe talk about it in theory, and we can talk about it in like idealized visions of the future. And I think it's possible. At some point, it's probably going to be possible.
Sure.
But we have to build on top of frameworks. And I say that in the sense of, going back to what you were saying about was I, in terms of like managing things like recovery and whatnot, like, was I able to do that? And I think, as I mentioned, I was able to do it on an individual level. I can see it with the students. We can have these conversations, but I had to do it in the context of a college class. But that was great because they did it for 4 weeks straight, and they saw what they were. It wasn't necessarily that. I'm not going to say that we, overwhelmingly changed people's ideas of what their habits were going to be, especially in college and especially with the particular college that I work with, right? And this is just what college life is. Yeah, you're dancing, but you're also doing sorority work. You're also really involved in on-campus stuff. You want to train outside because you want to have real-world experience, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to see all of these things allowed for confirmation of a lot what they were feeling. And I think that was like primary, like first step, important, right? And I think being able to show them that was, at least in my own personal work, was like, okay, that's a win, because we demonstrated that they were able to see things visually. I was able to see it as an educator. And if I were a coach, then there would be some other conversations to have depending on like performance. It gave certain types of information where somebody, for example, might say, I'm getting really good sleep, but my fatigue is still super high. My muscle soreness is super high. So now in the recovery conversation, you could more succinctly say that maybe sleep isn't your problem, right? Maybe we need to talk about mental health, nutrition, all these other things. And I think all across the board, when we talk about like when dancers and families and coaches are like, how do I figure out what I know best? How do I know what I need to do for nutrition? What I need to do for my performance? It always comes down to those 5 parameters, right?
So
Anyway, so that's an example of like how it can exist within a system. It happens on these small scales, and I think there are a lot of other wonderful people that are doing the same type of work. Yeah. It's also like, how does this translate into more actionable things? And so I think that was one of the questions. It was like, how do we get people on board? And more specifically, I think for many of us that work within the studio environment, how do we get parents on board, right? Because ultimately, if we were to look at context, once again, a studio is a dance studio or a training program. Ultimately, at the end of the day, is a business, and what numbers will drive business, and interest will drive numbers, and values will drive interest, right? And so what do we value? We definitely value hard work. We definitely value training. Maybe we place the value on like, certain individuals coming in and teaching classes and things like that, right? And so then if you were to say, once again, if all of a sudden we were like, hey, we're going to introduce this recovery class, but
I think it was,
it's like, and that's the thing, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh, so they're just going to do nothing, right? Like I feel like that's kind of
the myth or misunderstanding of it.
Yes. Yeah. So I think I just want to acknowledge that those are the types of energies we often work with in that environment. When it comes to more established institutions, a lot of it is funding. A lot of it is being able to get the resources to compensate the people that have this wealth of knowledge and to be able to incorporate it, right? And so when we go back to this conversation of how do we get everybody on the same page, I think it's just acknowledging that the environment, the person, the value, and what their goals are really going to dictate how you approach these types of conversations.
It's a great summary.
Yeah.
Better than I could have said it.
I don't know about that, man.
Yeah,
it can be a frustrating conversation, right? Because we know what it means, but at the same time,
I feel like
just because we know what it means doesn't necessarily mean, what is the entry point to that conversation?
Right. It's hard. I know, I read a statistic recently. It was like Gen Z itself, they prioritize like their health and wellness, but we're also at an age where like people are being priced out of it and cannot afford it, especially in communities that need it the most, which is like a broader topic about like, what is this wellness and fitness industry really for? But that's a whole nother conversation.
Yes. Yeah, no, agreed. And, to speak to that, we operate within a certain type of structure. Yeah. And then I think you agree that people get priced out of things nowadays.
So we had somebody listening in on our podcast recording during our live session, and the questions were asking about nervous system burnout, something Aaron had mentioned earlier in the podcast, and being able to identify that in the athletes we're treating. How do we identify, is this something chronic? Is this something acute? How are we differentiating this from things like DOMS or just general muscle soreness? And how do we identify these differences? For Aaron, there was a question about his comment regarding recovery for health versus recovery for performance. And for myself, there was a question about talking about the basics, the sleep quality, muscle soreness, mood, fatigue, and how oftentimes as healthcare providers, and especially newer healthcare providers, we often want to get to the flashy, sexy stuff. But how do we really look at how to help athletes, and in this case, dancers, identify the basics, be able to make that part of the recovery conversation beyond obvious musculoskeletal needs? And let's continue on.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's why this space exists, right?
Yeah. You want to talk about burnout stuff then?
Sure. Yeah. Fire away.
What? I mean, when I said that, I think it's because, having worked with like some female clients, like one of the things that I'm worried about now is like adrenal burnout, which is kind of like, how your body balances cortisol and stress and how that affects their ability to recover, and also like where they are in sport and training. Because everything they do or commit to, it's like there's going to be a cost to it, right? So and from like a lifting perspective, if you have a day where it's like a 1 rep max, like lift day, that's going to be very high on your central nervous system to like get that like full strength output. But on the flip side of that, if you're working with like a track and field athlete and they're like trying to sprint for as fast as they can, that's also high on the central nervous system. If you're looking at a dancer and they're doing like a full out, that's very high on their central nervous system, because it takes all these factors to like create like one perfect outcome, right? So when I think about like high performers, back to back performances, they're asked to like tap into that space every single time. But we only have so many like resources in our body and to produce that. And so, if I'm working with them day to day, like things that I will generally look for is like mood, like changes in their like, how they like walk and how they like interact with people. Sometimes I can tell just from like grip strength, like something that I know that they can carry feels suddenly very heavy for them and they just feel weak instead of like sore. I'm like, I think that's like a distinguisher, but I'm curious to see like what you think on.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a lot of it resonates too, primarily in the fact that we probably spend a lot of time with these people and we are in environments where we are able to do that. I will be honest and say that what I've learned about reading people has come less from my work being a physical therapist, because the way that we structure it is we usually see people like once a week. We are an out-of-network practice, and so we're not heavy on the frequency. We're heavy on like the autonomy and education and things like that. But I do spend a lot of time in the teaching space, and so, like you said, I'm not. I know there are different ways to measure the central nervous system, sort of like recovery, and some ways you might do this, like counter movement jump.
Yep, that's very popular.
Counter movement jump, or looking at RSI. Being able to reactive strength index, because these are all things that you need like quick power to do that can give you quick insight.
You also have plates.
If you need plates, yeah, we use more like wearables.
I use the wearables. Yeah.
And so then that gives you that statistical information that you could probably, make a judgment if you're like a coach. But I think as an educator and as a teacher, you identify things like mood, behaviors. Are they coming in and they're like, hey, what's up? Or are they coming in, they're kind of like, are they talking to their friends? Are they not really talking to their friends? Even when I walk into the studio, and even when I walk into the studio before I teach my class, I can see how they're kind of carrying themselves before they get in the class. Are they kind of like engaged and like talking with their friends and things like that? Or are they just kind of like laying in the dark like that?
Yeah.
Or are they on their phones? You know what I mean? So,
And it's an ongoing process too, I'm sure. Like,
yes.
like, how are they still like that 20 minutes in? Are still like that 40 minutes in?
Yes. Yeah. And I think this was, for me, it was, and I think I'm probably speaking more to like the educators as well. It's like, you can identify these things. Like if us as educators and even as healthcare professionals in our space are like, there's something different about how you're carrying yourself, then I think that off the bat should already, not to say that it's like a yellow flag or anything like that, but there is something that maybe they're looking for. Whether it's, that depends on the person, I think. Most of the time, I might even say the kiddos that I've been very fortunate to work with, sometimes they're just looking for someone to acknowledge the fact that they're just really tired, and I think that helps a lot to be seen and to be heard. I was very fortunate to have a dancer express that was one of the things that she took away, was that it was, even though she knew that she wasn't necessarily able to participate in our like strength and conditioning stuff to the best of her ability, the fact that like, hey, I'm very happy to like modify. Where are you at? What can we do today? Right. And once again, very easy to say RPE of 5. They know what that means because we'd rinse, wash, repeat that. So they know how to be comfortably challenged in the state that they're in. Right. So yes, it does go back to a lot of observation, and it does go back to building that trust in those types of relationships. Going back to the central nervous system load, I'd probably say cognitive load has a lot to do with that as well. So with the younger dancers I'm working with, especially junior high school, even during heavy testing weeks, that can also affect their ability to perform and their ability to be present, right? And I it's not a checklist of things I go down. I think I just had the chance to like watch these kids over time. So I think I have a pretty good idea. And I say I think because, it's like not definitive, but I have a pretty good idea of when I know a kid is like feeling lazy today versus like they're actually like burnt out. And chances are they're probably more actually burnt out. These kids work way too hard to be called lazy. You know what I mean?
Another round of questions that we received from this participant was, how do we talk about load management with a dancer or an athlete? And this is in the context of rehab, but also performance at the same time. So in the rehab context, how would you help them understand where they might need to slow down, where they might need to listen to their bodies and make sure that they're healing an area correctly? But then also, how do we keep them going and keep them engaged throughout the process for performance? And more importantly, how do we make this a comprehensive healing and also training experience so it makes sense for them? And here are our thoughts.
You want to take a stab at it?
Sure. I will speak. I'm going to speak a little bit to how I've navigated the conversation with the more specific population I work with, which is, youth and adolescent, contemporary, and ballet. But I think a lot of it can be applied, the theory side of it can be applied to like various populations, but it's creating as part of talking about load management, it's also about the recovery experience, right? So when I talk about load management, let's say with this example, someone's coming in with an ankle injury, but they need to build up things up to performance for summer intensive, right? Context here is that this person has been dealing with ankle pain for a long time, so they're already deconditioned. And so then we need to build up their conditioning so they can handle, 5 weeks of intensive training, but also rehab at the same time. So load management already turns into 2 separate conversations. We're looking at load management for, are you ready to perform? And so then this could be, to some extent, cardiovascular needs. At the very baseline, this is more specifically ballet. And so we're looking at, okay, you have to do 5 or 6 hours of dance a day for probably up to a month. So how do we build that up now? So I want you to, and they also can't build up to that number of classes because they are having ankle and foot things. And so you can't build capacity by taking more class, right? Or you can't build capacity by having them do like stuff on their feet. And so this is where we come down to modification of load. And so already I'm saying, this is what you have to do to just be a strong person. And your load of this is going to look very different from like your loading for your ankle.
Yeah.
And so not only have you talked about load management as a principle, you've now applied load management to two different situations. And so they have an understanding of, oh, load management can look like this, but load management needs to also look like this, right? So on one hand, we're looking at performance and your RPE and things like that. On the other hand, we're probably looking more at pain. And this is where we look at, in the recovery process, rarely are you going to be 100% pain-free. And that means like a safe place to move on. It's what's that safe range. And so we use that red light, we use a traffic light analogy.
Yeah.
So green light, yellow light, red light. And that's going to just kind of depend on where they're at because you're choosing 3 activities that they like to do or 3 important activities. So in our realm for PT, the PSFS, the patient-specific functional scale, which is just 3 activities that they rate 0 out of 10, 10 being I can do it, no problem, 0 being I can't do it.
Yeah.
And you use things that are meaningful to them, and then you kind of ebb and flow between what they're dealing with. And there's a whole other conversation on that with like pain management. But so going back to your question about load management, I've now separated it into 2 different things. And then how do we have this make sense? And I think sometimes this is where we talk about infrastructure and whatnot. So something that my staff and I changed recently was the type of exercise app that we were using to talk to patients. Before it was like a straight up, like, here's your HEP, do it 3 times a week, done, and it had all your basic exercises on there. Some of them were a little hilarious. But we switched over to something that was a bit more strength and conditioning based because now we can start to help them keep tabs of a few things. And so like, hey, this is your exercises to build up your capacity. And I want you to do, and we can organize it on a calendar. It's like really great.
It's real nice.
Yes. And this is not an endorsement, but shout out to Everfit. Thank you. So, and shout out to Open Mat Physio, Diana Wang, for introducing me to it. But I can categorize their exercises based off of day for like, this is your building capacity program. And then we separately look at, these are your exercises for your injury recovery. And so they can see how it starts to fit in.
Fits in the puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it a lot more work on our end? Yes. But does it give us way more clarity? Absolutely. Right. And so then, and I would say this is how, when we organize our exercises for our patients, sometimes when they start just with an injury, maybe for the first, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks, it's like just injury specific.
And then you start bleeding.
But then you start separating it because then they're like, oh, okay, it's 2 very different things. Going back to the conversation of load management, a lot of communication. So, and I love that we keep track of like how many classes they're taking. So I'll probably tell them like, hey, if you take a class, I want you to say, you took a class here. And so then I can see, great, we're up to like 3 classes, or we're up to at least 2 classes a day. And maybe every other day, let's sprinkle in a extra class, or maybe let's throw in some cardio, like you were saying, keep in that zone 2. So then you're not overloading the injury, but still building a cardiovascular capacity. And then that last week, we dial it down a little bit. So then they're not trying to like stay. And then, yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's the long version of that. That's an example of being able to talk about, I think, about load management, which is context. So you're like, this is load management for your injury. This is load management for what your specific goal is going to be. Yes.
I think on my end, I'm also very fortunate to work with like professionals too. And so these are people who are like, they've been in the game for like decades or years. If we do need to have that conversation, especially if it's around like injury or like pain management, it's, for me, I can ask them something as simple as like, what do you think you need? And, they'll usually give me an answer, and I try and see if like what I'm thinking, what they're thinking is aligned. If it's not aligned, then we do some more like interviewing and talking about it, because, they have their narrative and understanding of like what the problem is. And I have my research, my knowledge, my expertise, and we try and find like common point to where we can make a decision together that's going to help them. Right. So I think it's a very, I'm prioritizing different things than they are. Right. And it's like, if my job is to help them, I can't always have it like my way, I guess. Like I also have to make sure that it's something that they can achieve on their own too, and make it make sense for like their story and their recovery process. You know, when it comes to like, if I get more time with them and maybe it is very like breaking specific, like, oh, like, you know, I feel like super gassed doing like 3 windmills right now. And, you know, it's because like my core, my hips, whatever is not conditioned and stuff. The more you relate it back to their sport, it's like, oh, if you do this, this will help you like get back to where you need to go. Or if you follow this program, this will help you get back to where you go. Usually more than often, they're like, yes, like, let me do that, because, you know, as dancers, they love like a very like movement-based solution because it feels like they're doing something. You know, this like that's idea of like, I need to be working hard or doing something to feel like I'm reaching the solution. And then sometimes I will like take it a step back and I know whatever exercise they're doing is actually like, not, you know, not super intense, but it's like the act of doing something gets them in the mindset of like, I'm making progress towards a goal. So it's almost like sometimes I have to like be inception on them and like think 2-3 steps ahead of where they want to go, and then like lead them so that they feel like, oh yeah, this is actually where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be feeling. So sometimes we play like coaching games like that.
Yeah, I think, you know, just in terms of like recovery, if we take a step back in our roles and look at the person, be like, how are they experiencing the recovery? I think it would give us a lot of information on what would make sense to them and maybe what they're looking for, and then being able to take our clinical expertise and playing the games, as you said, inception. Yes.
Yep.
I think there's so much in dance and the application of these principles into the population that is just very unwritten at the moment. And we're always going to be ebbing and flowing, right? We're always going to be, you know, thinking about what does the individual need versus what does the group need versus what does the community need. And that's always going to look a little different. I think sometimes like the information is there. I think if and I've said this to a couple of other people who are just entering, not even just the dance space, but just the healing space too. It's, you know, helping them make sense of it, because everyone's needs are going to be a little different. So I think it's not information, but integration. And if we find a little bit more, if we direct our efforts into a little bit more on the integration side, I mean, we're talking long term, right? You're talking about having to keep up with how people are doing on a performance level, how they're responding to things. We already kind of do that with a lot of, for example, like tendinopathies, right? You're always looking for like a 24, 40-hour response kind of a thing. And so and then we just have to stretch that out. I will say that is probably more of a strength and conditioning conversation to have in my work as a physical therapist. I know it hasn't been a very robust conversation in like our past education. This is stuff I've kind of picked up on my own. I'm also very lucky to be in places to be able to put these things into action. So, I mean, my hope one day is that the structures and frameworks that exist will allow for people with more proper expertise to be in these areas. And I think it's happening. So, like I said, we're just trying to fill the gaps of what we can now to hopefully pave way for future peeps. Yes. Great. Any closing thoughts?
Recovery starts today.
The best time to plant a tree was yesterday. So the next best time, the best time was to plant a tree 20 years ago. The next best time is today. Yeah. True. I think too, and if you're listening to this after the fact and you're wondering why, you're wondering about these like conversations, I think this is where it has to go, kind of like speaking out and naming sort of the challenges that we often find. And it's really about like tailoring it to your spaces. So if, you're asking yourself, what are the best recovery tools, or what are the things that dancers need to know? I think first and foremost is just what are their goals? What is their life? As you mentioned, what is their story? What do they need to do? And then being able to piece it together, like making it make sense.
Yeah. And if you want specifics, connect with a professional.
Absolutely. Yes. Sleep hours, sleep quality, mood, fatigue, muscle soreness. Basic human things, right? How you recover, how you need to recover for the day will be dependent on the week or the 2 weeks before, will be dependent on the months before. So yeah, making it a ritual. Your recovery rituals. Oh, that's a good one. I'm a sucker for alliteration. Reframing recovery rituals. There we go.
Triple R
With Aaron Ngor. Oh God, dad brain coming in. And if you're listening on either Spotify or YouTube, I will have Aaron's information available. Link in bio. And yeah, we're just really looking forward to continuing these conversations in both of our spaces. We're here for the long game, and it's not an overnight change, but slowly chipping away. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate being here.
All right, and cut. Very nice.
Thank you for being here with us on Dance Rehab Dialogues. Whether you're guiding the next generation or continuing your own path as a mover, you're part of a bigger shift towards care that lasts and teaching that evolves with the dancer. These conversations definitely don't end here. They grow through the questions we ask, the curiosity we hold, and the small changes we make in the studio, on stage, and beyond. So here's to showing up, and we'll be right there with you. See you at the next one.